Forget what you think you know about Tudor England. Beyond the familiar tales of royal marriages and political intrigue, there was a woman whose resilience and sharp intellect truly challenged the status quo. Katherine Willoughby wasn't just a lady-in-waiting. She was a survivor, a patron, and a powerhouse who wielded significant influence in an age dominated by men. Prepare to be amazed by the untold story of the woman who truly lived beyond the Queen's shadow. Her life unfolds like a secret chapter hidden within the grand narrative of the Tudor court. A chapter filled with strategic alliances, dangerous convictions, and moments of quiet defiance against forces that sought to silence her. Born into privilege, Catherine quickly learned that titles alone could not guarantee safety or influence in a world where loyalties shifted with the wind, and a single wrong move could mean ruin. What set her apart was her ability to read the changing tides of politics and religion, and to adapt without ever abandoning her core beliefs. She was not merely swept along by history. She shaped it, using her position to protect reformist thinkers, nurture Protestant ideas, and build networks that would outlast the reigns of multiple monarchs. From her deep and intellectually charged friendship with Queen Catherine Parr to her daring exile during Queen Mary's rule, Catherine's story is one of unyielding courage and careful calculation. In an age when women were expected to remain in the background, she proved that influence could be wielded without a crown and that survival required more than just luck. It demanded intelligence, patience, and a willingness to take risks. Her life was marked by moments where faith and pragmatism collided, yet she navigated them with a grace and determination that kept her not only alive, but relevant in the most dangerous court in Europe. Katherine Willoughby's legacy is not simply about surviving the Tudor era. It's about thriving within it, using every tool at her disposal to support causes she believed in, and to protect those who might otherwise have been crushed by the weight of political and religious persecution. Her name may not appear as often as those of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, but her influence runs like a hidden thread through the tapestry of England's Reformation, connecting ideas, people, and events in ways that shaped the course of the nation's history. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video, we will journey deep into the life of Katherine Willoughby, a woman whose intelligence and resolve helped her navigate the razor's edge between power and peril, and whose untold story might just change the way you see Tudor England forever. Katherine Willoughby's story begins in the early 16th century, in an England still adjusting to the political, religious, and social changes brought by the Tudor dynasty. She was born into an aristocratic family whose wealth, status, and alliances placed her in the very heart of the English nobility. Her father, William Willoughby, 11th Baron Willoughby de Eresby, was a landowner of significant influence. Her mother, Maria de Salinas, was of Spanish origin and a close companion to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII. This maternal connection gave Catherine an early link to the royal court, one that would shape her upbringing and future path. From childhood, Catherine was immersed in an environment where the intrigues of politics and the shifting loyalties of court life were part of everyday conversation. Being the daughter of a baron and a lady of the Queen's chamber meant she was accustomed to privilege, but also to the subtle negotiations required to maintain influence within such a competitive world. When Catherine's father died while she was still a child, her life took an unexpected turn. As the only heir, she inherited the substantial Willoughby estates, instantly making her one of the wealthiest young women in England. This inheritance drew the attention of powerful men who understood that marrying Catherine would bring not only land and titles, but also social and political leverage. At the same time, her mother's closeness to the Queen gave her a degree of royal protection, and ensured that Catherine was not left vulnerable to opportunists without careful oversight. Catherine was placed under the wardship of King Henry VIII's trusted friend and brother-in-law, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Brandon was a man of formidable charm and ambition, one of the most influential figures in the Tudor court, and a favorite of the king. Initially, the arrangement was intended to secure Catherine's future through a strategic marriage, perhaps to one of Brandon's sons. The plan was entirely in keeping with the Tudor practice of using marriage as a political tool, consolidating alliances through careful placement of heirs and heiresses. However, the course of events was not so straightforward. When Charles Brandon's wife, Mary Tudor, the king's sister, died, the Duke found himself a widower in need of companionship and, perhaps more importantly, the means to restore and maintain his financial position. Brandon was known for his expensive lifestyle and had accumulated considerable debts over the years. Catherine's vast inheritance and her status as a wealthy ward under his control made her an attractive prospect, despite the significant age difference between them. In a move that surprised many at court, Brandon married Catherine himself. She was barely in her teens, while he was a seasoned courtier and warrior in his 50s. The marriage was unexpected not only because of the age gap, but also because it overturned the earlier plan to marry her into the Suffolk family through one of Brandon's sons. Instead, she became the Duchess of Suffolk, stepping directly into the role once occupied by Mary Tudor. For Catherine, this marriage instantly elevated her standing, placing her alongside one of the most powerful men in England. Yet it also placed her in a delicate position. As a young bride to a man with deep connections to the king, she had to navigate the complexities of being both a wife and a political figure in her own right. Her youth meant she had to mature quickly, learning the unspoken rules of influence within the Tudor court. While Charles Brandon's influence at court was undeniable, Catherine's role was not merely ornamental. Even in the early years of her marriage, she began to develop her own network of relationships, cultivating connections with influential courtiers, diplomats, and members of the king's household. Her mother's Spanish heritage and her own charm helped her stand out in a court that valued wit, beauty, and political acumen. The Tudor court in which Catherine found herself was a stage of constant performance, where every gesture, conversation, and alliance could influence a person's fortunes. Charles Brandon's proximity to Henry VIII meant that Catherine had direct access to the highest circles of power. This access allowed her to observe the shifting loyalties and rivalries that defined the era. She witnessed firsthand the king's marriages, the dissolution of his ties to Rome, and the Reformation that shook the religious foundations of the realm. Being part of Brandon's household meant she was often in the company of the king and his advisors, and while she was still young, she began to grasp the importance of political positioning and timing. Catherine's relationship with Charles Brandon was shaped by more than just political convenience. Brandon was known for his magnetic personality, his skill in tournament and warfare, and his close bond with the king. He had risen from relatively modest beginnings to become one of the most prominent nobles in England, largely through his charm and military service. For Catherine, marrying such a man meant inheriting both his allies and his enemies. It required her to align herself with his interests while also protecting her own inheritance and position. She learned early that influence in the Tudor court depended not only on title and wealth, but also on the ability to read people, anticipate change, and act with discretion. As the Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine quickly adapted to her new role. She became a hostess to foreign dignitaries, participated in court festivities, and fulfilled ceremonial duties that reinforced the prestige of her household. At the same time, she demonstrated an independence of mind that set her apart from many other noblewomen of her age. Her education, though typical for a girl of her station, was complemented by the political awareness she gained through constant exposure to court affairs. She became an astute observer of the king's temperaments and the ambitions of those around him. Over time, she began to develop her own voice in matters of religion and governance, laying the groundwork for the influence she would later wield. The power dynamics within her marriage were complex. Charles Brandon was an experienced political operator, but Catherine was not a passive partner. Her youth and beauty made her a visible figure at court, and her wealth gave her financial independence unusual for women of the time. Brandon relied on her estates to bolster his own resources, and in turn, she relied on his protection and position to secure her place in the political hierarchy. Yet as the years went by, Catherine began to assert herself more confidently. She formed friendships with reform-minded figures and displayed an interest in the emerging Protestant ideas that were gaining ground in England. This religious inclination would later become a defining aspect of her public identity, especially after Brandon's death. Her marriage to Charles Brandon placed Catherine at the center of the Tudor world during some of its most turbulent years. She witnessed the fall of Anne Boleyn, the brief reign of Jane Seymour, the king's ill-fated marriage to Anne of Cleves, and the dangerous politics surrounding Catherine Howard. Through it all, she maintained her position, a testament to her ability to adapt to changing circumstances. She learned that survival in Henry VIII's court required a careful balance of loyalty, discretion, and the strategic cultivation of alliances. Catherine's transformation from a young heiress to a duchess in one of the most powerful households in England was not merely a result of her marriage. It was also the product of her own intelligence and resilience. While her early life had been shaped by the decisions of others, her father's death, her mother's guardianship choices, the king's decision to place her in Brandon's care, her later life would increasingly be defined by her own choices. The skills she developed during her years with Brandon would serve her well after his death, when she would navigate the dangerous waters of Edward VI's Protestant court, and later endure the Catholic reaction under Mary I. Katherine Willoughby's story in these early years is one of transformation. From a child of privilege to a young woman thrust into one of the most powerful marriages in the kingdom, she evolved into a political figure in her own right. Her connection to Charles Brandon gave her immediate access to the center of Tudor power, but it was her ability to learn from and adapt to that environment that positioned her as more than just a wife. She became a participant in the great religious and political shifts of her time, a woman whose influence would only grow as the century progressed. Her early experiences in the court of Henry VIII, shaped by her aristocratic heritage, her unexpected marriage, and her keen observation of power, laid the foundation for a remarkable career in one of England's most volatile periods. Katherine Willoughby entered the world during a time when England was under the rule of the Tudor dynasty, a period marked by great ambition, political maneuvering, and dramatic shifts in both religion and governance. Her birthright and family connections placed her near the heart of royal power from her earliest days, giving her an intimate view of the monarch's household and the circles of influence surrounding it. Her father, William Willoughby, the 11th Baron Willoughby d'Aresby, was a man of considerable standing, a landowner with estates that stretched across significant portions of Lincolnshire. Her mother, Maria de Salinas, was not merely a noblewoman of Spanish descent, but also one of the most trusted companions of Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII. This maternal tie to the Queen created a natural bond between Catherine and the royal household, one that would shape her upbringing, opportunities, and eventual position in society. From the moment she could understand the world around her, Catherine was surrounded by the customs, etiquette, and expectations of the courtly environment. Though she was not born inside the palace walls, her mother's constant presence in the Queen's chamber meant that Catherine was never far from royal influence. She was exposed to the rituals of monarchy, the pageantry of state occasions, and the constant presence of courtiers whose ambitions and loyalties could shift with the king's favor. The Tudor court was a place where relationships were currency, where a person's fortunes could rise or fall based on the king's smile or frown. And Catherine's family was well placed to benefit from proximity to the throne. When her father died while she was still a child, Catherine's circumstances shifted dramatically. She became the sole heir to the Willoughby estates, inheriting not only vast lands but also a status that made her one of the most eligible young women in England. The death of her father also placed her more firmly under her mother's care, and Maria de Salinas was determined to protect her daughter's interests. The Queen's affection for Maria ensured that Catherine remained within the sphere of royal oversight, and this closeness to the monarchy provided a layer of security that few other heiresses enjoyed. Yet, it also meant that her future was likely to be shaped by the needs and strategies of those at the highest levels of power. King Henry VIII himself took an interest in the fate of prominent wards, and Catherine's wealth and lineage made her an asset worth managing. Her wardship eventually passed to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, the king's closest friend and brother-in-law. This decision was not without significance. Brandon was one of the most trusted men in the realm, a figure whose military achievements, charm, and loyalty had earned him a place at the king's side. By placing Catherine under his guardianship, the crown ensured that her marriage would be arranged in a way that served both her interests and the political objectives of the Tudor dynasty. The plan, at least initially, seemed straightforward. She might be married to one of Brandon's sons, uniting her wealth with his family's prestige. However, even before her marriage, Catherine's position as the ward of the Duke of Suffolk brought her into even closer contact with the royal family. Brandon's household was intimately connected to the court, and Catherine's life as his ward would have been one of regular attendance at court functions, banquets, and ceremonies. She would have been a witness to the personal interactions between Brandon and the king, observing firsthand the kind of loyalty and discretion required to maintain royal favor. She would have seen the way alliances were formed through careful conversation, how disputes were settled behind closed doors, and how quickly one could be cast out of favor if the king's trust was betrayed. This early exposure to the realities of court life was more than a social education. It was a lesson in survival. The Tudor court was not merely a place of splendor. It was also a place of danger, where missteps could be fatal to one's reputation or even one's life. Catherine learned from observation how relationships were often transactional, how marriages were arranged less for love and more for political advantage, and how the shifting tides of religion and policy could turn allies into enemies almost overnight. Her mother's friendship with Catherine of Aragon meant that Catherine's early years were intertwined with the fortunes of the Queen herself. She would have been aware, even as a young girl, of the growing tension between the Queen and the King as Henry sought to annul his marriage in favor of Anne Boleyn. The eventual fall of Queen Catherine must have left an impression on Catherine, serving as a powerful example of how even those closest to the king were not immune to his changing desires and political calculations. This was an early foreshadowing of the instability that could come from relying too heavily on royal favor. When Queen Catherine was set aside, Maria de Salinas remained loyal to her until the end, famously defying orders to be at the Queen's deathbed. Catherine would have seen in her mother a model of courage and loyalty, qualities that she herself would later exhibit. Yet, she would also have understood the cost of such loyalty, as the Salinas family's influence at court diminished with the Queen's fall. This dual lesson, of the value of steadfastness and the peril it brought, would inform Catherine's later approach to alliances and friendships within the court. Catherine's proximity to the royal family was not only political, but also personal. The Tudors were a small royal house by European standards, and members of the high nobility often interacted directly with the sovereign. Banquets, hunts, and court entertainments were occasions where personal charm could be as important as political service. Catherine's intelligence, wit, and beauty, combined with her wealth and status, ensured that she was noticed. In such an environment, every word and gesture could be interpreted as a sign of loyalty, ambition, or discontent, and Catherine learned to navigate these subtle currents with care. The presence of Charles Brandon in her life was perhaps the strongest early link to the king outside of her mother's connection to Queen Catherine. Brandon's position as the king's confidant meant that Catherine was frequently in the company of the monarch himself. She saw how Henry rewarded loyalty with titles, lands, and favor, but also how quickly he could turn on those who disappointed him. She would have heard the whispers that circulated in the palace corridors, the rumors of the king's intentions toward his wives and ministers, and the strategies courtiers used to protect themselves from the king's unpredictable moods. This environment of constant negotiation and shifting alliances was the backdrop against which Catherine's early identity was formed. She was not an idle observer. Even as a young woman, she was learning how to present herself in a way that invited trust while revealing little of her own intentions. This ability to manage perception would become one of her greatest strengths, allowing her to navigate some of the most dangerous years in English history with her status intact. The closeness to the royal family in her formative years also foreshadowed the complex relationships that would define Catherine's later life. The Tudor court was a web of personal loyalties and political necessities, and Catherine would eventually find herself enmeshed in this web, not only as a participant, but as a figure of influence. Her marriage to Charles Brandon, unexpected though it was, would bind her more tightly to the king's inner circle, giving her both power and the responsibility that came with it. Yet, even before that union, she had already absorbed the rhythms of court life and understood the importance of strategic alliance. Her upbringing among those who served the king directly meant that Catherine could never fully separate personal relationships from political ones. Friends could become rivals, allies could turn into enemies, and affection could be overshadowed by ambition. The fate of her mother's royal mistress was a constant reminder that intimacy with power carried risks as well as rewards. As she matured, she would come to balance the warmth and loyalty she inherited from her mother with a cautious, calculated approach to survival that was in Catherine's childhood and early youth can be seen as a preparation for the intricate dance she would later perform as a leading noblewoman in the reigns of Henry VIII and his children. Her nearness to the royal family taught her the value of discretion, the necessity of adaptability, and the importance of cultivating allies without appearing to challenge the authority of the crown. These lessons, learned through observation and experience, would guide her through the political and religious upheavals that lay ahead. The foreshadowing of her later life was everywhere in her early years. She saw how Queen Catherine's steadfastness in the face of Henry's will brought her honor among the people, but left her powerless in the face of the king's determination. She saw how Charles Brandon's charm and adaptability allowed him to remain in favor despite occasional missteps. She saw how courtiers who overreached or spoke too freely could fall from grace overnight. And she saw how wealth and status could protect a person to some extent, but never completely. Catherine's initial proximity to the royal family was therefore both a privilege and a training ground. It gave her the opportunity to move in the highest circles of power, but it also taught her that such proximity required constant vigilance. The relationships she formed in these early years, shaped by affection, necessity, and ambition, were the foundation of the complex network she would later maintain as a duchess, a political figure, and a woman whose life intersected with some of the most powerful people of her time. Katherine Willoughby's life intersected with some of the most formidable and intriguing women of the Tudor age. But few relationships were as significant to her intellectual and spiritual development as the one she shared with Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of King Henry VIII. Their connection was rooted not merely in the common ground of noble birth or proximity to the throne, but in a deeper meeting of minds, a shared curiosity for learning, and a bold engagement with reformist religious thought during an era when such convictions could court danger. In an England fractured by shifting religious policies and fluctuating royal favor, their friendship and alliance were remarkable for the mutual respect, trust, and courage they exhibited. When Catherine first came to know Catherine Parr more closely, she was already a woman of influence in her own right. As the widow of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Catherine held not only vast estates but also a recognized place among the king's circle of trusted nobles. Catherine Parr, by the time of her marriage to King Henry, had a reputation for intelligence, piety, and tact. She was also known for her humanist education, her fluency in multiple languages, and her interest in religious reform. In Catherine Parr found not just another lady-in-waiting or fellow noblewoman, but an intellectual equal and a sympathetic spirit who shared her passion for study and her willingness to question the religious orthodoxy of the day. Their early exchanges, whether conducted in the great halls of court or in more private settings, reflected the vibrant intellectual culture of the time among certain circles of the nobility. Catherine Parr, well-read in theology and history, encouraged discussion of the scriptures and the reformist writings emerging from continental Europe. Catherine, equally sharp-witted and deeply curious, engaged in these conversations with enthusiasm. They would have discussed passages from the Bible in English, an act that had been dangerous only a few years earlier, as well as the works of reformist scholars like Erasmus and the translated sermons of Martin Luther and other continental thinkers. The English Reformation was far from a straightforward process. It had begun under Henry's rule primarily as a political maneuver to free himself from papal authority and secure his own divorce, but it had unleashed theological debates that could not easily be contained. The court, in many ways, mirrored the divisions of the kingdom at large, with some clinging to traditional Catholic practices and others advocating for deeper reforms. Katherine Willoughby and Catherine Parr both leaned toward the reformist camp, but they exercised their convictions with caution, especially in Henry's presence. The king himself could be unpredictable in matters of faith, favoring reform one day and punishing heresy the next. One of the bonds that cemented their relationship was their shared belief in the importance of personal engagement with Scripture. Catherine Parr was a strong advocate for allowing laypeople, including women, to read the Bible in their own language, a position that was still contentious among conservative clergy. Catherine not only agreed but took this principle to heart in her own household, encouraging Bible reading among her servants and dependents. It was a quietly radical act, for it suggested that spiritual authority did not reside solely in the clergy, but could be exercised by individuals in their own homes. In Catherine Parr, Catherine found a model of how to pursue reformist beliefs while maintaining a position in the heart of royal power. Catherine had to tread carefully, particularly after her marriage to Henry, but she still managed to publish works of religious devotion under her own name, an extraordinary achievement for a queen. Her books, such as Prayers or Meditations, were deeply personal expressions of faith, yet subtly infused with reformist ideas. Catherine admired this blend of piety and intellectual assertiveness, and she mirrored it in her own way, more through action than through publication, but with no less conviction. There were moments when Catherine's independent thought became more visible, even at the risk of controversy. She was known for her plain-speaking nature and her refusal to flatter unduly, qualities that set her apart in a court where calculated flattery was often a survival skill. Her religious convictions sometimes brought her into subtle conflict with more conservative figures. For instance, she did not hide her disdain for superstitions and practices she considered remnants of papal influence, and she was not afraid to express skepticism toward ceremonies and rituals she saw as lacking scriptural basis. These were dangerous opinions in an environment where the boundaries of acceptable belief were constantly shifting according to the king's mood and the influence of his advisors. One notable episode that showcased her willingness to challenge norms occurred when she mocked certain Catholic practices in the presence of those who still clung to them. Her wit could be biting, and while this endeared her to reformist allies, it also earned her enemies among the conservative faction. Catherine's sharp tongue was not mere carelessness. It reflected a confidence in her position and a conviction that truth should be spoken even if it was unpopular. However, she was not reckless. She understood the limits imposed by the king's authority and the delicate balance that had to be maintained to avoid outright accusations of heresy. The religious atmosphere in England during this period was fraught with peril for anyone suspected of stepping too far toward Protestantism. The persecution of reformists under Henry's later years was real, and even Catherine Parr herself narrowly escaped arrest at one point due to her reformist sympathies. Catherine, being close to the Queen, would have been aware of just how close her friend came to ruin. This incident likely reinforced the need for prudence, but it did not dampen Catherine's commitment to her beliefs. Instead, it seemed to deepen her resolve to support reform quietly yet effectively. Their relationship extended beyond theological discussion into mutual support during political tensions. The Queen relied on a trusted inner circle of women who could be confidants and allies, and Catherine's loyalty was unwavering. She was not merely a follower, but an active participant in the Queen's reform-minded initiatives, lending her prestige and influence to projects that encouraged education and religious engagement. Together, they modeled a form of female leadership that was both intellectual and practical, grounded in moral conviction but adaptable to the realities of court politics. In their private moments, it is likely that Catherine and Catherine Parr discussed not only theology, but also the personal challenges they faced as women in positions of power. They navigated a world dominated by men, where their voices were often dismissed or scrutinized, and they had to maintain impeccable reputations while influencing matters of great consequence. For Catherine, who had already managed her own estates and navigated the treacherous politics of widowhood, Catherine Parr's example as a queen who could guide the king's thinking and still preserve her dignity was a powerful affirmation of her own strategies. After Henry's death, the religious climate in England shifted dramatically under the rule of his young son, King Edward VI, whose regents favored more openly Protestant policies. For Catherine, this was a vindication of the reformist leanings she and Catherine Parr had long nurtured. However, the Queen's life took a different turn after the king's death, as she remarried to Thomas Seymour and withdrew somewhat from the political center. Catherine remained active in the cause of reform, lending her support to Protestant exiles and continuing to speak out against what she saw as lingering corruptions in the Church. Even after Catherine Parr's death, the intellectual and spiritual bond they had shared continued to influence Catherine's actions. She carried forward the principles they had both championed, educating those under her care, encouraging direct engagement with Scripture, and supporting reformist preachers. Her willingness to speak her mind, even when it put her at odds with powerful figures, was a testament to the legacy of her friendship with the Queen. The danger of holding independent religious opinions in this era cannot be overstated. The reign of Mary I, which followed Edward's, brought a return to Catholic orthodoxy and a fierce persecution of Protestants. Catherine, however, managed to avoid the fate of many reformist leaders by living abroad for a time, though not without personal cost. Her departure from England during this period was a strategic retreat, rather than a surrender of conviction. Her survival owed much to the prudence and adaptability she had honed during her years alongside Catherine Parr, observing how the Queen navigated the shifting sands of royal favor, while holding to her beliefs. In reflecting on Catherine's relationship with Catherine Parr, it becomes clear that their alliance was more than a friendship of convenience. It was a meeting of two sharp minds and two courageous spirits, each reinforcing the other's resolve to think independently in matters of faith. They demonstrated that women at the Tudor court could be more than ornamental presences. They could be active participants in the theological and political debates of their time, shaping the direction of religious thought and influencing the lives of those around them. Their intellectual bond also highlights the broader role of women in the English Reformation, a role often overlooked in histories that focus primarily on kings and male bishops. Through conversation, patronage, and example, Catherine and Catherine Parr contributed to the spread of reformist ideas, not through grand public speeches but through the quieter, persistent work of persuasion, education, and personal example. This was influence exercised within the constraints of their positions, yet it was no less significant for being subtle. Catherine's life after Catherine Parr's death was marked by continued engagement with reformist causes, a testament to the enduring impact of their shared convictions. She supported Protestant exiles during times of persecution, corresponded with reformist leaders, and maintained her outspoken disdain for religious practices she deemed unbiblical. Her courage in these matters was undoubtedly strengthened by the years she spent in the company of a queen who shared her vision of a reformed, scripture-centered faith. The story of Katherine Willoughby and Catherine Parr is one of mutual empowerment in a dangerous era. They were women who refused to be mere spectators in the great religious debates of their time, choosing instead to engage fully and to act by their beliefs, even when doing so carried real risk. Their friendship was not only a source of personal comfort, but also a catalyst for action, shaping the course of their lives and leaving a quiet but lasting mark on the religious landscape of Tudor England. Katherine Willoughby's life in the Tudor court was one of shifting fortunes, subtle maneuvering, and quiet but determined resistance to the constraints of her era. She began as a figure well placed within the inner circles of royal favor, her marriage to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, having given her both prestige and influence. As a young widow in possession of considerable lands and wealth, she enjoyed a position that allowed her to speak with a degree of candor rare for women at court. Yet over time, the very qualities that made her remarkable, her intelligence, wit, and independent religious convictions, would place her in a more precarious position. Her journey from a court insider, protected by proximity to the throne, to a woman whose reformist beliefs carried real risk is a story of adaptation, courage, and unyielding faith. When she was the Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine's life was in many ways secure. Her marriage to Charles Brandon, one of King Henry VIII's closest friends, placed her within a network of influence that shielded her from many of the dangers faced by lesser courtiers. She was young, beautiful, wealthy, and intelligent, and she had a place in the glittering world of the royal household. While this position came with its pressures, expectations of loyalty, discretion, and the ability to navigate factional rivalries, it also allowed her to develop relationships with key figures, including Queen Catherine Parr, that would shape her later convictions. The religious atmosphere of Henry's court in these years was complex. The break from Rome had been accomplished, and the king was head of the Church of England, but this did not mean England had embraced full Protestant reform. Henry's religious policy was one of calculated ambiguity, maintaining many traditional Catholic doctrines while allowing certain reformist measures, such as the translation of the Bible into English. This ambiguity created a space in which reform-minded individuals like Catherine could explore new ideas, but it was also a dangerous space, where the boundaries of acceptable belief were constantly shifting. At first, Catherine's reformist leanings were a matter of private conversation and personal practice rather than public confrontation. In the company of Catherine Parr and like-minded courtiers, she could discuss scripture in English, question certain traditions, and express admiration for the writings of continental reformers. She was careful to frame her views in ways that emphasized loyalty to the king and respect for his authority, thus avoiding accusations of sedition or heresy. Her position as a duchess gave her a platform, but it also required discretion. However, as time went on, Catherine's convictions grew stronger, and she began to express them more openly. This shift was partly due to the influence of Queen Catherine, who modeled a form of piety that was deeply personal, intellectually engaged, and reformist in orientation. The Queen's example encouraged Catherine to take a more active role in promoting reformist ideas, not only within her own household, but in the broader sphere of patronage and public life. She began to support preachers known for their Protestant views, and to correspond with reformist thinkers. Her transition from private sympathizer to more public advocate was gradual, shaped by the changing political and religious climate. Under Henry, the risks of outspoken reformism were significant. The king's willingness to execute both conservatives and reformers who displeased him created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Catherine was aware that her safety depended on maintaining the king's goodwill, and she was careful not to challenge him directly. But she also understood that the court was not the only arena in which influence could be exerted. Through her estates, her patronage, and her network of contacts, she could promote reformist teaching and practice without attracting the same level of scrutiny that open court debate would invite. The death of Charles Brandon in the early 1540s left Catherine in an unusual position for a woman of her time. As a wealthy and titled widow, she had a degree of independence rare for her sex, and she used it to manage her estates and direct her household according to her beliefs. She insisted on the reading of the Bible in English, encouraged the education of women and girls, and fostered an environment in which questioning traditional religious practices was not only permitted but encouraged. This was a significant step away from the controlled environment of the royal court, where such activities were more closely monitored. Her growing reputation as a woman of strong convictions inevitably attracted attention, both positive and negative. Reformists saw her as an ally and a source of support, while conservatives viewed her with suspicion. Her wit, which had once been an asset at court, sometimes became a liability, as she was not afraid to mock practices she considered superstitious or unbiblical. This outspokenness, though admired by her allies, risked alienating those who still held to more traditional beliefs. The reign of King Edward VI, beginning in the year 1547, initially seemed to vindicate Catherine's position. The regency government that ruled in Edward's name pursued a much more openly Protestant agenda, and reformists like Catherine found themselves in a more favorable environment. She was able to support Protestant clergy and initiatives without fear of royal disapproval, and her status as a noblewoman gave her considerable influence in shaping local religious life. This was a period of relative freedom for her convictions, and she used it to strengthen the Protestant cause in her own sphere of influence. But the accession of Queen Mary in 1553 brought a dramatic reversal of fortunes. Mary's commitment to restoring Catholic orthodoxy meant that Protestants, especially those who were outspoken or prominent, faced persecution. Many of Catherine's allies were arrested, exiled, or executed. Her own position was now dangerous. She was known for her reformist beliefs, and her high profile made her a potential target. It was in this context that Catherine made the decision to leave England, seeking safety abroad. This period of exile marked the full transition from court insider to religious exile. She was no longer operating within the protective sphere of royal favor. Instead, she was part of the network of Protestant refugees who sought to preserve their faith in the face of persecution. Living abroad was not without hardship. She was separated from her lands, her income, and the familiar structures of her life, but it allowed her to continue practicing her religion openly, and to maintain contact with other reformist leaders. Her time in exile deepened her convictions and broadened her perspective. She witnessed firsthand the struggles of other Protestant communities in Europe, and she participated in the exchange of ideas that connected reformists across national boundaries. This international dimension to her beliefs reinforced her sense of belonging to a cause that transcended the politics of any single kingdom. She returned to England only after Mary's death and the accession of Elizabeth, whose religious settlement, while not as radical as some reformists had hoped, at least provided a safer environment for Protestant practice. By this point, Catherine was a seasoned veteran of religious and political conflict. She had moved from the secure but constrained world of a royal court favorite to the uncertain, but liberating position of an independent religious actor. She had learned to navigate the shifting tides of royal favor, to adapt her strategies to changing circumstances, and to use her influence in ways that advanced her convictions without unnecessarily provoking her opponents. Her journey illustrates the costs and rewards of holding strong, potentially controversial beliefs in an age when religion was inseparable from politics and identity. As a court insider, she had the ear of the powerful but was constrained by the need for discretion. As an exile and outspoken reformist, she risked her safety but gained the freedom to speak and act more openly. The transition was not a single event, but a gradual process shaped by personal loss, political change, and spiritual conviction. Katherine Willoughby emerged as a figure defined not merely by her titles or her court connections, but by her steadfast commitment to her beliefs. Her life demonstrates the possibilities open to a woman of intelligence and determination in the Tudor world, as well as the dangers that accompanied any deviation from the prevailing orthodoxy. She began as a participant in the elegant but treacherous game of court politics, and ended as a survivor of exile, a patron of reform, and a woman whose convictions had been tested and refined by the most turbulent decades of the English Reformation. Katherine Willoughby's life spanned one of the most volatile periods in England's religious and political history, a time when the throne itself dictated the faith of the realm, and when a misjudged word or an ill-timed association could lead to ruin or death. That she survived the rapid and often violent shifts from Henry VIII's cautious, personally controlled break with Rome, to the Protestant reforms of Edward VI, and then to the Catholic Restoration under Mary I, is a testament to her remarkable resilience and adaptability. Her ability to navigate these years without losing her wealth, her estates, or her influence, while also remaining true, in the long arc of her life, to her deeply held Protestant convictions, marks her as one of the most astute and steadfast figures of the Tudor age. By the time Edward VI ascended the throne in the year 1547, Catherine had already endured profound personal and political changes. The death of her husband, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, had left her a young widow, but also one of the wealthiest women in England. Her position was unusual. She held significant lands in her own right, commanded the loyalty of retainers, and was tied by her former marriage to the very center of Tudor power. She was not merely a passive inheritor of her husband's fortune. She was actively involved in the management of her estates and in the political networks that had sustained the Suffolk household. Edward's reign initially seemed a providential moment for a woman of Catherine's convictions. The Boy King's Regency Council, dominated by men sympathetic to Protestantism, unleashed a wave of reforms that aligned with Catherine's own beliefs. The removal of many Catholic rituals, the spread of English Bibles, and the encouragement of preaching in the vernacular. In this new atmosphere, Catherine did not have to hide her views. Indeed, she could publicly support preachers and scholars who advanced reformist theology without fear of royal censure. Her close friendship with Queen Catherine Parr, who herself had Protestant sympathies and had narrowly escaped conservative plots under Henry, further emboldened her. This was a period in which Catherine's religious commitment became more than personal piety. It was expressed through patronage and active encouragement of reform. She welcomed Protestant clergymen into her circle, ensured that her tenants and household were exposed to reformist teaching, and corresponded with figures in the wider European Protestant movement. She also made strategic decisions about her children's education, ensuring that they were brought up in the Reformed faith, and exposed to humanist and theological learning that would reinforce their convictions. Yet Catherine was not naive about the fragility of this new order. She had seen how quickly the tides could turn under Henry, where 1 month a reformer might enjoy the king's favor, and the next, face execution for heresy. She understood that Edward's reign depended heavily on the stability of his regents and the boy's own health. While she took advantage of the opportunities the Protestant ascendancy offered, she also maintained a careful eye on the political landscape. She did not squander her resources on reckless displays of defiance against conservative holdouts. Instead, she worked steadily to build a base of loyal allies and to consolidate her estates, ensuring her financial independence regardless of political change. When Edward died in 1553 at the age of 15, the balance of England's religious future shifted abruptly. Mary, the daughter of Henry and his first wife Catherine of Aragon, ascended the throne with a clear and determined aim to restore Catholicism and re-establish papal authority. For someone like Catherine, whose Protestant identity was both personal and public, the new queen's accession was a moment of grave danger. Mary's regime wasted little time in reversing the reforms of Edward's years. Latin liturgy was reinstated, clerical marriage was banned, and the heresy laws were revived, paving the way for the Marian persecutions that would burn Protestant men and women at the stake. Many of Catherine's friends and associates were among those targeted. Bishops who had been prominent under Edward were imprisoned or executed. Ordinary preachers who had benefited from her patronage were silenced or forced underground. Catherine's position as a high-ranking noblewoman and widow of one of Henry's most trusted friends offered some protection, but it was no guarantee of safety. She was well known for her reformist leanings, and her wit and sharp tongue had, in the past, made her enemies. A careless remark or an ill-chosen association could be used against her in this climate. The question before her was how to remain true to her beliefs without inviting persecution, and how to safeguard her family's estates from confiscation should she fall out of favor. It was here that Catherine's strategic acumen came fully to the fore. She assessed the risk and recognized that remaining in England, under close scrutiny, would be dangerous. At the same time, she understood that the survival of her wealth and influence required careful legal and financial preparation. Before departing, she arranged for her estates to be managed in a way that would protect them from seizure in her absence. She appointed trustworthy agents to oversee her lands, and ensured that legal ownership was clearly documented. She also likely made use of her social network to create informal protections, alliances with individuals who, though Catholic under Mary, might still respect her status and act in her interest. Her decision to go into exile was not one of panic, but of calculation. She joined the growing community of Marian exiles, English Protestants who fled to the continent to escape persecution. Many settled in Protestant strongholds such as Frankfurt, Strasbourg, or Geneva, where they could worship freely and engage in theological discussion without fear of the flames. In exile, Catherine's experience as a noblewoman of influence gave her a unique role. She was not merely a refugee, but a figure who could lend material support and legitimacy to the Protestant cause abroad. She maintained correspondence with exiled theologians and reformers, offering both encouragement and, where possible, financial assistance. Her time on the continent also broadened her perspective. She witnessed the diversity of Protestant practice across Europe, and encountered strands of thought that differed from the English reforms she had known under Edward. This exposure deepened her understanding of the challenges and possibilities of building a Reformed church. It also reinforced her sense that her own role was not confined to England. She was part of a broader, transnational struggle for the future of the Christian faith. While in exile, Catherine kept a careful watch on events in England. She was keenly aware that her eventual return would depend on a change in the monarchy, or a significant shift in policy. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, and the increasingly harsh persecution of Protestants made it clear that such a change would not come quickly. She therefore settled into the rhythms of exile life, while ensuring that her absence did not weaken her claim to her lands. Her agents in England sent her reports, and she remained in communication with allies who could act on her behalf should any legal or political challenge to her holdings arise. This balancing act, maintaining a strong presence in exile while preserving her authority and property in England, was a remarkable feat. Many exiles lost their estates through confiscation or mismanagement, but Catherine returned to England after Mary's death in 1558 with her wealth and influence intact. Elizabeth's accession brought a Protestant settlement, albeit one more moderate than many reformers had hoped. For Catherine, it meant safety and the opportunity to re-engage in English religious life. Her return was not merely a restoration of her former position. It was the culmination of years of careful strategy. She had preserved her resources, maintained her networks, and emerged from exile with enhanced credibility among Protestants. She was a survivor not because she had compromised her beliefs, but because she had the foresight to adapt her tactics to the circumstances. In the world of Tudor politics, where fortunes could be destroyed overnight, this adaptability was as valuable as courage. Even under Elizabeth, Catherine's religious convictions sometimes placed her at odds with the official line, which sought to avoid alienating more conservative subjects. But by now she was a seasoned player, capable of advancing her views without provoking open conflict with the crown. She continued to support Protestant clergy and causes, ensuring that her estates remained centers of reformist influence. Her life during the reigns of Edward and Mary thus reveals a consistent pattern. Catherine never abandoned her core beliefs, but she adjusted her methods according to the political climate. Under Edward, she advanced Protestantism openly, confident in royal support. Under Mary, she withdrew physically from England to preserve her life and her resources, knowing that she could be more useful to the cause alive and well-funded than as a martyr whose lands would pass into hostile hands. This was not cowardice, but strategic wisdom. She understood that survival was itself a form of resistance, allowing her to continue the work of reform in the long term. In this way, Katherine Willoughby embodied a kind of resilience that went beyond mere endurance. She was proactive in shaping her own fate, anticipating dangers before they became unavoidable, and making choices that protected both her personal safety and the broader Protestant cause. She adapted not by compromising her principles, but by recognizing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to stay and when to leave. Her exile was not a retreat in defeat, but a repositioning for the future. When history remembers the Marian exiles, it often focuses on theologians and writers who carried the Protestant message in pamphlets and sermons. Yet figures like Catherine were equally crucial, providing the material and social support that allowed the exiled community to survive and maintain its sense of purpose. Her wealth, her title, and her experience at court gave her a standing that few others possessed, and she used it with a shrewdness that ensured her survival through one of England's most dangerous decades. Katherine Willoughby's life offers one of the most compelling examples of how intelligence, patience, and calculated risk-taking could mean the difference between survival and destruction in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. She lived through the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, each bringing a drastically different religious and political climate. Many of her contemporaries, noblemen and women with equally high birth and privilege, did not live to see such longevity. Some were executed, some died in disgrace, others were stripped of their lands and titles. Catherine, by contrast, not only survived but managed to retain her wealth, her estates, and a position of influence throughout these turbulent decades. Her ability to do so was not the product of mere luck or royal favor. It was the result of playing what might be called the long game, a strategy that combined patience, adaptability, and a keen understanding of the motives and weaknesses of those around her. Catherine's foundation for this long-term survival began with her early position at court, and her marriage to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, one of Henry VIII's closest companions. From the start, she learned how proximity to power worked. She saw firsthand how quickly a favorite could fall from grace, and how court factions rose and collapsed with dizzying speed. Even as a young woman, she displayed a sharp observational skill that allowed her to read the political temperature and act accordingly. She learned to hold her tongue when needed, to speak with wit and pointed meaning when the moment was right, and to choose her alliances carefully. One of her greatest advantages was her financial independence. As the widow of the Duke of Suffolk, she controlled substantial estates and revenues. This gave her a degree of autonomy that many women of her era could never dream of. But wealth alone was not a guarantee of safety. Indeed, in times of political upheaval, it could make one a target. Catherine understood that preserving her holdings meant knowing when to assert her rights, and when to allow events to unfold without her direct interference. She resisted the temptation to take sides too publicly in factional disputes unless the outcome was nearly certain. By doing so, she avoided being swept away in the purges that often followed political victories. During the reign of Edward VI, Catherine's Protestant convictions aligned well with the direction of royal policy. She supported reform, patronized Protestant clergy, and moved openly in reformist circles. But even in this relatively favorable environment, she avoided the trap of overconfidence. She did not overextend herself in attacking conservative opponents, knowing that the death of the young king could bring about a reversal. This restraint was not born of fear, but of strategic foresight. She had witnessed Henry VIII turn on both Catholics and Protestants who displeased him, and she understood that no religious policy in England could be regarded as permanent. Her foresight proved crucial when Edward died and Mary I, a staunch Catholic, took the throne. Many of Catherine's Protestant associates were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Some refused to compromise their beliefs and paid the ultimate price. Others stayed in England and attempted to hide their convictions, often unsuccessfully. Catherine chose another path, voluntary exile. To many, leaving England might have seemed like an admission of defeat or a coward's choice, but for Catherine it was the opposite. It was a calculated move to preserve her life, her influence, and her resources so that she could continue the Protestant cause in the long term. Before departing, she took meticulous steps to secure her estates. She arranged for trustworthy agents to manage her properties, ensured her legal claims were airtight, and cultivated allies among those who would remain in power under Mary. By doing so, she minimized the risk of her lands being seized in her absence. Her decision was a masterclass in strategic retreat. She removed herself from immediate danger without forfeiting her long-term position. In exile, Catherine did not simply wait for the political tide to turn. She remained active in Protestant networks across Europe, offering material support to fellow exiles and maintaining correspondence with influential reformers. She learned from the experiences of Protestant communities on the continent, absorbing their theological debates and observing how they navigated their own political challenges. This period broadened her perspective and strengthened her resolve, preparing her for her eventual return to England. When Mary died and Elizabeth I ascended the throne, Catherine returned to her homeland in a position of strength. Many of her contemporaries who had remained in England under Mary had been executed or impoverished. Others who had gone into exile returned to find their estates lost or their influence diminished. Catherine, by contrast, had preserved both her fortune and her reputation. Her return was not as a supplicant seeking royal favor, but as a noblewoman of means and standing who could offer valuable support to the new regime. Elizabeth's religious settlement was more moderate than Catherine might have wished, retaining certain ceremonial elements that many Protestants regarded as too Catholic in nature. Yet Catherine, now a seasoned political survivor, recognized that pressing too hard for further reform could alienate the Queen and jeopardize her influence. She continued to patronize Protestant clergy and causes, but she did so without publicly challenging the monarch's authority. This balance allowed her to maintain her position at court, while still advancing her religious ideals through more subtle channels. Catherine's ability to outlast so many of her peers lay in her disciplined approach to risk. She was neither timid nor reckless. She understood that survival in Tudor England required a willingness to adapt without abandoning one's core principles. She could be bold when the circumstances were favorable, as under Edward, and she could be cautious when the dangers were high, as under Mary. This flexibility was not a betrayal of her beliefs, but a recognition that the fight for those beliefs was a long one, and that a living advocate could do far more than a dead martyr. Her intelligence was complemented by a keen sense of timing. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to align herself with a powerful figure, and when to keep her distance. She resisted the allure of short-term victories that might bring long-term consequences. Many at court fell into the trap of overreaching, seeking rapid advancement through bold gestures, only to fall victim to a shift in royal favor or a sudden change in policy. Catherine's steadier approach meant that she rarely exposed herself to such reversals. It is also worth noting that Catherine's wit and outspokenness, which might have endangered a less careful courtier, were tools she wielded with precision. She could deliver a pointed remark that revealed her disdain for superstition or corruption, but she knew her audience and chose her moments wisely. Her reputation for intelligence and frankness was part of her identity, but it was never allowed to overshadow her strategic goals. By the later years of her life, Catherine had become something of an institution, a figure who had been present through the most momentous changes of the Tudor era, and had emerged from each with her influence intact. She had seen religious reform rise, fall, and rise again. She had navigated the dangerous waters of factional politics. She had endured exile and returned stronger. In doing so, she demonstrated that in a world obsessed with immediate gains, there was immense power in playing for the long term. Her story stands as a lesson in the value of patience, preparation, and adaptability. Many of her contemporaries underestimated the need for these qualities, believing that noble birth or royal favor would shield them from danger. Catherine knew better. She understood that the court could be both a place of opportunity and a trap, that religion could be both a source of unity and division, and that survival required not only faith but foresight. Katherine Willoughby's legacy is not only that of a committed Protestant noblewoman, but of a master strategist who understood the art of endurance. She knew that the tides of politics and religion could not be controlled by any one individual, but that they could be navigated with skill. She played the long game with an intelligence and cunning that ensured she would be remembered not as a victim of her times, but as a survivor who shaped them. Katherine Willoughby's life was deeply intertwined with the religious upheavals of 16th-century England, and one of the most consistent threads running through her story is her unwavering commitment to the Protestant cause. She was not merely a silent supporter or a figurehead whose name was used by others. Instead, she played an active, deliberate, and often decisive role in shaping the intellectual and theological direction of the reformist movement in England. Her patronage of Protestant scholars, her encouragement of reformist literature, and her deliberate cultivation of circles where religious ideas could be discussed and refined all speak to a mind deeply engaged with the pressing questions of her age. Catherine had been influenced early in life by the humanist and reformist currents that were moving through the English court during the reign of Henry VIII. Her marriage to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, gave her a position of great visibility, but it was her own intellect and religious curiosity that led her to seek the company of learned men and women who were questioning long-held church practices. She did not simply absorb ideas passively. She debated them, reflected on them, and used her position to ensure that reformist voices had the means and the freedom to reach wider audiences. Her patronage was not limited to the offering of funds, though that alone was a substantial contribution in an age when printing and publishing still required considerable investment. She provided her protégés with the protection of her name and status. In a time when heresy laws could be revived at any moment, and when the expression of reformist ideas could mean imprisonment or worse, such protection could be the difference between survival and destruction. Scholars and preachers who were under Catherine's patronage could often speak and write more freely than they might otherwise have dared. One of Catherine's most enduring legacies is the network of Protestant scholars who either benefited directly from her support or moved within the intellectual circles she helped cultivate. This network included not only English thinkers, but also continental reformers with whom she corresponded. Letters were one of her most important tools. They allowed her to exchange theological arguments, to learn about the progress of reform in other lands, and to offer moral and material encouragement to those facing persecution. Many of these letters reveal a woman of sharp mind and deep conviction, unafraid to engage with complex doctrinal issues or to challenge accepted interpretations. Her friendship with Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, was an important factor in her reformist activities. The two women shared a love of learning and a commitment to Protestant theology, and their conversations likely deepened Catherine's engagement with religious matters. Catherine Parr herself was a published author of devotional works, and Catherine moved in the same literary and theological milieu. Together, they formed part of a broader circle of court women who were unusually well-educated for their time, and who used their positions to promote religious reform both directly and indirectly. Catherine's influence extended into the realm of publishing. She supported the translation and distribution of Protestant works, including those that brought the scriptures and reformist commentary into the English language. The availability of these works was crucial to the spread of Protestant thought, and Catherine understood the power of the printed word to change hearts and minds. By ensuring that such works reached a broad audience, she helped to create a more informed and engaged public, one that was better equipped to resist a return to old religious forms when political circumstances shifted. Her patronage also had a personal dimension. She took a direct interest in the welfare of the scholars and preachers she supported. This was not merely charity but an investment in people whose work she believed could advance the cause of truth as she understood it. She often provided them with safe lodgings, introductions to other influential figures, and the means to continue their work when they faced financial hardship or political danger. This blend of material support, personal encouragement, and intellectual engagement made her a uniquely effective patron. The letters Catherine wrote during her period of exile under Mary I demonstrate the depth of her commitment. While many of her contemporaries in exile focused solely on their own survival, Catherine continued to think in terms of the larger movement. She kept in touch with exiles scattered across the continent, helped to coordinate aid for those in the most desperate circumstances, and encouraged continued preaching and teaching even when it had to be done in secret. She never saw exile as a pause in her work. Rather, it was a shift in the battlefield, one that required new strategies but the same steadfast commitment. Catherine's intellectual circles were not confined to the formal settings of universities or churches. Her own household often served as a center for discussion and debate. Guests could expect to encounter not only fine hospitality, but also searching conversations about scripture, church policy, and moral duty. She valued learning and inquiry, and she welcomed those who could contribute to these exchanges, whether they were clerics, writers, or laypeople with a serious interest in theological matters. By doing so, she fostered an environment where reformist ideas could be tested, refined, and spread beyond the immediate circle of scholars. This blending of public and private influence was one of Catherine's strengths. She knew that formal sermons and printed treatises could reach many, but she also recognized the importance of personal influence, of conversations over a meal, of letters that might travel from hand to hand. In an era when censorship was often heavy-handed, such informal channels could carry reformist thought to places where official publications could not. Catherine's role in sustaining these channels was both deliberate and far-reaching. Her intellectual prowess is evident in the way she could adapt her arguments to different audiences. With fellow reformers, she could discuss doctrine at a high level of sophistication, weighing scriptural evidence and theological reasoning. With those less well-versed in theology, she could frame her arguments in more practical or moral terms, emphasizing the need for personal devotion, the reading of scripture in one's own language, and the rejection of corrupt practices. This ability to speak to different audiences without diluting her message was a mark of her skill as both a thinker and a communicator. Even as political and religious tides shifted, Catherine maintained her core commitments. Under Edward VI, her activities could be more open. Under Mary I, they had to be more discreet and often conducted from abroad. But in either case, the essence of her work was the same: to nurture a community of believers who were well-informed, resilient, and capable of carrying the Protestant cause forward. By the time Elizabeth I came to the throne, Catherine's long years of patronage had borne considerable fruit. Many of the men she had supported earlier in their careers were now established leaders in the church or respected writers and preachers. They carried with them the ideas, confidence, and networks that her patronage had helped to create. In this way, Catherine's influence extended far beyond her own lifetime. She had not only participated in the religious debates of her day, she had shaped the very framework within which those debates took place. Katherine Willoughby's role in promoting religious reform cannot be reduced to a few acts of generosity or isolated moments of advocacy. It was a sustained, multifaceted effort that combined material support, intellectual engagement, and strategic networking. She understood that ideas needed champions, that champions needed resources, and that both ideas and champions needed protection in a world where the stakes were often life and death. Her life demonstrates the power of sustained patronage, especially when guided by a clear vision and deep conviction. She did not seek glory for herself, but worked to ensure that the reformist cause would have the thinkers, writers, and preachers it needed to survive and thrive. In doing so, she became one of the quiet architects of England's religious transformation, a figure whose contributions were all the more effective for being grounded in personal relationships and intellectual respect rather than in mere displays of wealth or status. Katherine Willoughby's life and work cannot be separated from the broader narrative of the Reformation, both in England and across Europe. While she never stood in a pulpit to preach or sat in a scholar's chair to lecture, her contribution to the shaping of English Protestantism was profound and enduring. She lived during a century when England's religious identity shifted repeatedly, sometimes violently, between Catholic and Protestant, between traditional and reformist interpretations of Scripture. Through all these changes, Catherine remained steadfast in her convictions, demonstrating a rare combination of principled belief and strategic adaptability. In doing so, she not only survived but actively influenced the direction and durability of Protestant thought in her country. Her legacy is best understood within the context of the Reformation as an international movement. By the time Catherine came of age, Martin Luther's theses had already been nailed to the church door in Wittenberg, and the shockwaves of that act were still reverberating throughout Europe. Reformist theology was being debated in Switzerland, France, the German states, and the Low Countries. England's place in this movement was complicated. Henry VIII's break from Rome in the early 1530s was political before it was theological, driven by his desire to annul his marriage rather than by any deep-seated sympathy for Protestant doctrine. Yet even under Henry, reformist ideas gained a foothold, carried into the country by scholars, preachers, and printed works. Catherine's early exposure to these currents came through her position at court and her association with influential reform-minded figures, most notably Catherine Parr. These connections gave her not only access to new ideas, but also the opportunity to observe how those ideas could be advanced or destroyed by political maneuvering. From the beginning, she seems to have understood that the survival of Protestantism in England would depend as much on careful stewardship and protection as on theological argument. Her marriage to Charles Brandon brought her into the highest levels of aristocratic society, but it also taught her a key lesson. Proximity to power was a double-edged sword. Power could be used to shield reformist thinkers and promote new doctrines, but it could just as easily be withdrawn, leaving reformers vulnerable to persecution. Catherine's role in the Reformation would be shaped by this understanding. She would use her influence to advance Protestant causes when the political climate was favorable, and she would find ways to sustain those causes in quieter, less visible ways when the climate turned hostile. Under Edward VI, when Protestantism was officially embraced, Catherine was able to act more openly. She supported the appointment of Protestant clergy, encouraged the distribution of reformist literature, and patronized scholars whose works advanced the cause of religious renewal. This was a period of optimism for English Protestants, and Catherine took full advantage of it, helping to lay the foundations for what many hoped would be a permanent transformation of the Church. Yet she never mistook this moment of freedom for a final victory. Her caution proved wise when Edward's death brought Mary I to the throne. Mary's commitment to restoring Catholicism was unyielding, and her reign quickly became a time of peril for those who had been most active in the Protestant cause. Many of Catherine's contemporaries faced imprisonment, execution, or the loss of all they owned. Catherine chose exile, a decision that reflected both her determination to preserve her life and her recognition that she could still serve the Reformation from abroad. While in exile, Catherine became part of a wider network of Protestant refugees scattered across Europe. She corresponded with other exiles and with reformers on the continent, exchanging news, theological reflections, and practical support. This was an important aspect of her legacy. She helped to sustain the morale and cohesion of the English Protestant community during its time of greatest vulnerability. By keeping these connections alive, she ensured that when the political tide turned again, there would be a cadre of committed and organized leaders ready to return. Her time abroad also deepened her understanding of the Reformation as an interconnected movement. She saw how reformers in different regions adapted their strategies to local conditions, how they addressed the challenges of translating scripture, and how they dealt with internal disagreements over doctrine. This exposure reinforced her belief that the English Reformation was part of a larger struggle, one that required solidarity and mutual support across national boundaries. When Mary's death and Elizabeth I's succession allowed her to return to England, Catherine brought with her the experience, connections, and perspective she had gained in exile. Elizabeth's settlement was a compromise, retaining certain traditional forms while affirming Protestant doctrine. For some reformers, this was disappointing. For Catherine, it was an opportunity. She recognized that pressing too hard for a more radical settlement could risk destabilizing the new regime and undoing the gains already made. Instead, she continued to work within the system, supporting Protestant clergy, encouraging further theological education, and fostering networks of like-minded believers. Her contribution to shaping English Protestantism lay partly in this pragmatic approach. She understood that religious change in England would not be achieved through a single dramatic act, but through steady, persistent effort. By supporting a generation of preachers and writers, she ensured that Protestant ideas would take root not only in the institutions of the Church, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. Catherine's legacy is also evident in the way she helped to integrate women into the intellectual life of the Reformation. Her own example as a learned, articulate, and theologically engaged noblewoman challenged the notion that religious discourse was solely the domain of men. She encouraged other women to read Scripture for themselves, to educate their children in Protestant doctrine, and to take an active role in the moral and spiritual life of their communities. In this way, she broadened the base of the movement, and ensured that it would not depend solely on the authority of male clergy or scholars. Her patronage extended beyond her lifetime through the men and women she mentored. Many of those who had benefited from her support went on to occupy positions of influence in the Elizabethan Church, carrying forward the theological perspectives and priorities that she had championed. Through them, her influence continued to shape the development of English Protestantism well into the later decades of the century. Even in death, Catherine's example resonated. She embodied a model of lay leadership that combined personal piety, intellectual engagement, and political shrewdness. She demonstrated that the Reformation was not only a movement of theologians and rulers, but also of laypeople who used their resources and talents to advance the cause. This model inspired others to see their own potential role in the ongoing work of reform. Katherine Willoughby's enduring legacy in the Reformation was thus multifaceted. She was a protector of reformers, a patron of scholarship, a cultivator of networks, and a shaper of public opinion. She navigated the treacherous currents of Tudor politics with enough skill to preserve her life and influence, using both to further a cause she believed to be divinely mandated. By the time she died, the Protestant faith had a secure foothold in England, and the church she had worked to nurture was well positioned to survive future challenges. Her life reminds us that religious transformation is rarely the work of a single figure or moment. It is the product of many hands and minds, working in concert over time. Catherine's particular contribution was to ensure that the English Reformation had both the intellectual foundations and the human infrastructure it needed to endure. She saw the movement not as a temporary political convenience, but as a permanent shift in the spiritual life of the nation. And she worked tirelessly to make that vision a reality. Katherine Willoughby's life is often remembered in passing, usually framed by her association with more famous figures such as Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, or her friendship with Catherine Parr, the last queen of Henry VIII. Yet when examined closely, her own story reveals a woman of remarkable agency, intelligence, and conviction, whose contributions to English history go far beyond the roles assigned to her by birth or marriage. She was not content to be a passive participant in the great dramas of the Tudor period. Instead, she actively shaped the political, religious, and intellectual landscapes in which she lived, leaving a legacy that deserves far greater recognition than it has traditionally received. From an early age, Catherine was positioned at the intersection of power and influence. She inherited wealth and title in her own right, an unusual circumstance for a woman in the 16th century, and her marriage to Charles Brandon brought her into the highest circles of the English court. Many in her position would have been content to maintain their place through careful conformity and social grace. Catherine, however, was more than a decorative presence in court life. She observed, learned, and acted with a clear understanding of how to navigate the dangerous political environment of the Tudor era, one marked by sudden changes in favor and lethal consequences for miscalculation. Her influence extended well beyond the personal sphere. Catherine's active involvement in religious reform was a central part of her life, and it was here that her agency was most visible. While her association with Catherine Parr helped bring her into reformist circles, she was not merely a follower or supporter of others' agendas. She engaged deeply with Protestant theology, corresponded with scholars and reformers both in England and on the continent, and offered material and political support to those whose work she believed advanced the truth of the gospel as she understood it. This was not a safe path to take. The Tudor period was one of sharp religious reversals, as the country shifted from Catholicism under Henry VIII to more radical Protestantism under Edward VI, back to staunch Catholicism under Mary I, and then to a moderate Protestant settlement under Elizabeth I. For someone of Catherine's prominence, being too closely identified with the wrong side at the wrong time could be fatal. Yet she persisted, adjusting her strategies as needed without abandoning her convictions. Her period of exile during Mary's reign is a testament to both her commitment and her pragmatism. By leaving England, she preserved her life and much of her wealth, enabling her to continue her work for the Protestant cause from abroad, and to return when the political climate was once again favorable. Catherine's resilience was matched by her political acumen. She understood the importance of patronage in an age when scholars, preachers, and writers depended on the support of the powerful to survive and be heard. She used her resources to sustain a network of reformers, providing them not only with funds but also with the protection of her name and status. This allowed them to speak more freely, and to circulate works that might otherwise have been suppressed. By fostering these voices, she helped to shape the intellectual foundation of English Protestantism in ways that continued to bear fruit long after her death. Her contributions are particularly striking when set against the limitations imposed on women in her society. The Tudor world was profoundly patriarchal, with political, religious, and intellectual authority largely reserved for men. Women of rank were expected to secure alliances through marriage, manage households, and act as symbols of their family's honor and influence. While Catherine fulfilled these roles, she also expanded them. She demonstrated that a woman could be an active participant in the theological debates of her day, a shaper of public opinion, and a protector of those who advanced causes she valued. Her story challenges the assumption that women in the 16th century were merely passive recipients of history's currents. In Catherine's case, we see a woman who understood those currents, anticipated their shifts, and positioned herself to influence their direction. She did so not through direct political office, something denied to her by law and custom, but through the strategic use of her social position, wealth, and intellect. This was a form of power that, while less visible than the crown or the council chamber, could be just as effective in shaping outcomes. Catherine's life also complicates the popular image of the Tudor court as a purely glamorous and ruthless stage dominated by monarchs and their closest advisors. Her experience shows that the court was also a place where ideas were exchanged, alliances were forged based on shared belief as well as political expediency, and women could play crucial roles in the life of the nation, even if their contributions were often overlooked by official chroniclers. Through her patronage and her example, Catherine encouraged a culture of learning, scriptural study, and religious engagement that extended beyond the narrow confines of formal institutions. The fact that her legacy has been so often overshadowed by her more famous connections is in itself a reflection of how women's contributions to history have been minimized. Charles Brandon's career, Catherine Parr's authorship, and the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I have all been thoroughly documented and analyzed. Yet Catherine, who interacted with all these figures and whose actions influenced the religious direction of the nation, is too often relegated to the margins of these stories. By bringing her life into clearer focus, we gain a more accurate and more nuanced understanding of the period as a whole. Her agency is perhaps most clearly seen in the way she navigated danger. Many of her contemporaries were undone by their inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Catherine, by contrast, combined steadfast principle with strategic flexibility. She knew when to speak boldly and when to act quietly, when to remain in England and when to leave, when to align herself closely with the crown, and when to cultivate influence outside of court politics. This balance allowed her not only to survive, but to continue advancing her causes over the course of several reigns, outlasting many who had seemed more powerful in the moment. Her life is also a reminder that influence can be exercised in many ways, some of them indirect but no less significant. By supporting scholars who translated scripture into English, by encouraging preachers who spoke to common people in their own language, and by sustaining networks of reformers during times of persecution, Catherine contributed to the shaping of English religious identity at the grassroots level. These contributions did not always make headlines, but they helped to ensure that Protestantism in England was not simply a top-down imposition, but a movement with deep popular roots. In reflecting on Katherine Willoughby's story, we also see the resilience of women who refused to be defined solely by their relationships to men. While her marriages and friendships with prominent figures undoubtedly shaped her opportunities, she consistently acted in ways that asserted her own judgment and priorities. She was a partner in her own right in the shaping of policy, the nurturing of reform, and the defense of conscience. Her life invites us to reconsider the narratives we tell about the Tudor age, not as a series of events dictated by monarchs and their male advisors, but as a complex tapestry woven by men and women, aristocrats and commoners, whose choices collectively shaped the destiny of the realm. Katherine Willoughby's place in English history is secure not because she stood at the center of power, but because she understood how to work effectively from its edges. She turned her proximity to the throne into an instrument for advancing her beliefs, but she did not depend solely on royal favor for her influence. By building lasting networks of reformers, investing in education, and maintaining a principled stance through times of both opportunity and danger, she left behind a legacy that outlived her and helped to shape the character of the English Church for generations. Her story offers a valuable corrective to the traditional picture of the Tudor world. It reminds us that the resilience, intelligence, and agency of women played a crucial role in an era often defined by the actions of men. It also shows that power in a patriarchal society could take many forms, and that women like Catherine could wield it with as much skill and purpose as any of their male contemporaries. In recognizing her contributions, we gain not only a fuller understanding of the Reformation and the Tudor period, but also a richer appreciation for the ways in which determined individuals, regardless of gender, can shape the course of history. History is often told as a grand stage upon which a few towering figures dominate the spotlight, their names preserved in chronicles, portraits, and monuments. Monarchs, generals, and great statesmen tend to fill our history books, their stories interwoven with the major events that define nations. Yet the deeper we look into the fabric of any era, the more we discover threads belonging to individuals whose roles were no less significant, though their names may be far less known. Katherine Willoughby is one such figure, a woman whose life intersected with the most powerful people of Tudor England, yet whose own choices, convictions, and actions shaped the course of religious reform and influenced the social and political currents of her age. Her life invites us to think differently about the way history is written and remembered. Catherine did not wield power in the way a king or queen might, with armies or decrees at her disposal. Instead, she shaped events through a mixture of strategic alliances, patronage, correspondence, and quiet but firm resistance to forces that sought to silence her. She was a woman who refused to let the constraints of her time define the limits of her contribution. When the political winds shifted dangerously, she adapted without surrendering her core beliefs. When the religious landscape hardened against her convictions, she found ways to nurture reformist thought from exile, ensuring that ideas she valued survived to influence the next generation. Her example demonstrates that the impact of an individual is not always measured by titles held or public honors received. In an age when women were rarely credited for political influence, she proved that it was possible to act with purpose, to sustain a network of allies, and to remain a voice in the conversation even when absent from the court. Her patronage of Protestant scholars, her protection of reform-minded clergy, and her encouragement of theological debate contributed to a movement that would define England's religious identity for centuries. Without her, and others like her, the Reformation in England might have taken a different course, less resilient in the face of persecution, less connected to continental ideas, and perhaps slower to root itself in the minds of ordinary people. When we examine her life, we see a constant interplay between personal conviction and political necessity. This is the reality for many historical figures who operated outside the absolute center of power. They had to be both committed and careful, visionary and pragmatic. Catherine's survival across the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I was not accidental. It was the result of calculated choices that balanced faith, loyalty, and self-preservation. She was not merely fortunate. She was deliberate, reading the times and adjusting her position accordingly without betraying her deeper commitments. And yet, for all her importance, her name remains largely absent from the common understanding of Tudor history. The stories of her husbands, her royal connections, and her famous friends are far better known than her accomplishments. This raises a larger question about the nature of historical memory. Why are some contributions celebrated and others left in obscurity? In Catherine's case, gender plays a significant role. The patriarchal structures of her time, and of subsequent centuries, often reduced women to supporting characters in the narratives of men. Even when women acted decisively and left tangible marks on political or cultural life, their influence was frequently attributed to the men around them or dismissed as incidental. This pattern is not unique to the Tudor age. Across history, countless individuals, especially women, minorities, and those operating outside formal power structures, have shaped events in ways that are rarely recorded or acknowledged. Their absence from mainstream narratives is not a reflection of their lack of significance, but rather a result of who gets to tell history and whose stories are deemed worthy of preservation. The life of Katherine Willoughby reminds us to look more closely, to ask whose hands and minds were at work behind the scenes, sustaining movements, influencing decisions, and guiding change without standing at the front of the stage. In recovering her story, we also open the door to recovering the stories of others like her. Every historical era is full of such figures: aristocrats who acted as political brokers, merchants who financed movements, writers whose works circulated privately and shaped opinion, or reformers who traveled quietly from place to place, spreading new ideas. Many of them lived in the shadow of more famous contemporaries. Yet without them, the great transformations of history would not have unfolded as they did. Catherine's life serves as an invitation to look beyond the obvious, and to recognize the complexity of the forces that shape the world. It challenges us to acknowledge that history is not solely the product of kings and queens, battles and treaties, but also of sustained effort by those whose names may not be household words. Her legacy, rooted in resilience, intelligence, and conviction, shows that influence can take many forms, some visible, some subtle, all essential. And so, we are left with a final, persistent question, one that reaches beyond the Tudor period and into every chapter of the human story. If Katherine Willoughby's impact could be so profound yet so easily overlooked, how many other lives remain hidden in the shadows of history, their contributions waiting to be rediscovered, their voices ready to change the way we understand the past?
Catherine's life is a strong reminder that history is not only made by kings, queens, and famous leaders. It is also shaped by people who work quietly but with great purpose, using their intelligence, courage, and determination to make a difference. She lived in a time when women had very few rights and were expected to simply follow the path chosen for them by men. Yet, she showed that a woman could think for herself, make bold choices, and stand up for her beliefs even when it was risky. Throughout her life, Catherine faced many changes in England's politics and religion. The country moved back and forth between Catholic and Protestant rule, and those who supported the wrong side would lose everything, including their lives. Catherine remained true to her Protestant faith, even when it meant she had to leave her home and live in exile. She was careful and smart, knowing when to speak out and when to act quietly, but she never gave up on what she believed was right. One of her most important contributions was her support for Protestant scholars and preachers. She used her money and her influence to help them write, publish, and spread their ideas. This was more than just giving charity. It was a way of shaping the future of religion in England. Because of her help, many people were able to read and hear teachings that might otherwise have been silenced. Catherine's story is also about resilience. She lived through the controls of four very different rulers, and each brought new challenges. Many powerful people in her time fell from favor or were destroyed because they could not adapt. Catherine survived and continued to have influence because she understood how to move with the times while keeping her principles. Her life teaches us that real strength is not just about winning battles or holding high office. Sometimes it is about staying steady in the face of change, finding ways to keep working for your goals, and using whatever power you have, no matter how small it may seem, to make a difference. Catherine may not be as famous as some of the people she knew, but her actions left a mark on English history. She shows us that even in a society that tried to limit her, a determined and thoughtful person could still shape the world around them. Her story ends on a hopeful note that courage, intelligence, and patience can help us face any challenge, and that even if our names are not remembered by everyone, the effects of what we do can last far beyond our lifetimes. She reminds us that history is full of people like her, men and women, whose quiet strength and steady efforts changed the course of events. The only question is how many more of their stories are waiting to be found?